Turn in your Bibles to Hosea, chapter 11. Don't you just love God's word? We're in chapter 11, starting at verse 12. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful to the Holy One. Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. The Lord has an indictment against Judah, and he will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. In the womb he took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us. The Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial name. So you, by the help of your God, return. Hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually for your God. A merchant in whose hands are false balances, he loves to oppress. Ephraim has said, but I'm rich. I've found wealth for myself. In all my labors they cannot find in me iniquity or sin. I am the Lord your God. From the land of Egypt I will again make you dwell in tents, as in the days of the appointed feast. I spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions, and through the prophets gave parables. If there is iniquity in Gilead, they shall surely come to nothing. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls. Their altars also are like stone heaps on the furrows of the field. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he guarded sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded. Ephraim has given bitter provocation, so his Lord will leave his blood guilt on him and will repay him for his disgraceful deeds.
Marcia. Well, we are continuing our sermon series through the book of Hosea together this morning, and I hope you all enjoyed the encouraging picture of God as Father last week, how he loves us and has compassion on us and restores us, because we're back to the accusations and judgment again this week, as Marcia just read. That's really been the pattern all throughout this book, hasn't it? It's been more weeks like that than the other. Really, all the way back to chapter 4, that's been the pattern. If you remember, just to kind of recap where we've been in Hosea really quickly, in the first 3 chapters, we had the personal story of Hosea and his wife Gomer and their 3 children. And we saw how Hosea's wife was unfaithful to him, and how God then had Hosea pursue his wife and call her to return to him. And then how Hosea's marriage was a picture of God's relationship with his people Israel. Like they too are unfaithful to him, and so God pursues them and calls them to return to him. And so from chapter 4 then through the end of the book, that's what God is doing. He's calling his unfaithful people over and over and over again to turn from their spiritual adultery against him and return to him. And he does that through these cycles of accusation and judgment that each end in a call to return. And so the first cycle ran from chapter 4 through the beginning of chapter 6, where God accuses Israel of not knowing him, and he warns them of the judgment that will come on them, but then he calls them to truly know him. And he promises to ultimately heal and restore them. And then from the end of chapter 6 through chapter 11 last week, we saw God accuse Israel of continual unfaithfulness to him. And he warns them again and again of the judgment that's coming. But then last week we saw in chapter 11 that in spite of their unfaithfulness to him, the Lord loves Israel like a father loves his child. And so even though he's going to punish them for their sin, he loves them too much to give them up. So he's not going to ultimately come in wrath and destroy them, but he's going to roar like a lion, and his children will respond to his voice and return to him. And so now, starting in our passage this week through the end of the book, we have one more cycle of accusation and judgment that is going to ultimately culminate in hope at the very end of the book. And so what we're going to see here, though, in this cycle of accusation and judgment is that it's going to flow out of our passage from last Sunday. And so remember, last week the point was that the Lord is a father to Israel. But what we're going to see this time is that Israel acts like their physical father, Jacob. That instead of being so blown away by God's fatherly compassion and love toward them, that they turn from their idols and return to him and worship him and trust him to bless them like he promised. Instead, they respond by acting like their father Jacob the deceiver. They lie, they deceive, they manipulate, they scheme, they wrestle to get everything they can for themselves at the expense of anyone and everyone else. Instead of trusting that God will bless them like he promised, they take matters into their own hands and desperately fight for the blessings that God had already promised to give them and that they could only get from him. And so you can see from the main points on your handout there, what we're going to see in this passage is that God accuses Israel of being deceitful like Jacob, their father. And he warns them then that he's going to deal seriously with their deceitfulness. But in the middle of the accusation and judgment, we do get one little glimmer of hope. And that hope is tied to the fact that God transformed Jacob. So he calls Israel to turn from their deceitfulness like their father Jacob did. And so what we're going to see as we walk through this passage then is that this is us too. That Jacob may or may not be your physical ancestor in the same way that he was for Israel, but we are all born deceivers just like him. And our deceitfulness might not look exactly the same as it did for Israel, but we'll see as we go through this just how parallel our tendencies are to try to fight in our own strength for what God has already promised to give us and what we can only get from him. And so ultimately then, the call to Israel to turn from their deceitfulness is the call to us as well. So let's look at the first few verses of the passage here just to kind of set things up. And then we're going to need to jump back into Genesis briefly and kind of refresh our memory of Jacob's story so that we can see all the connections that Hosea is drawing here. And then we'll see how Israel's deceitful like their father Jacob, how God is going to deal seriously with their deceitfulness, how their only hope is to turn from their deceitfulness like their father Jacob, but then how all that confronts our deceitfulness as well. So look with me here in your Bibles. Hosea chapter 11, verse 12 is where we're picking up. So let's start reading there again. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah still walks with God and is faithful with the Holy One. So as we've seen throughout Hosea, Ephraim's the largest tribe in the northern kingdom of Israel. So Hosea often uses that name to refer to the whole northern kingdom. And so God is speaking here, and he's saying that Israel has surrounded him with lies and deceit. Like their lies and deceit are so rampant, it's like nothing but lies and deceit everywhere. It's all God sees. But even more than that, even more than just being rampant, it's like it's an attack on him. It's like Israel has him surrounded by their lies. It's like they're laying siege to an enemy city, and they're trying to take it over. Except in this case, their enemy is God, and their weapons are lies and deceit. And so it's a shocking picture, especially coming where it does right here on the heels of what we looked at last week. Like we go from this beautiful picture of God as a father, remembering how he taught Ephraim to walk and how his compassion grows warm and tender toward them, how they're going to respond to his voice because they're his children. And then the very next verse, they're surrounding him with lies and deceit. And then the second part of this verse is kind of tricky. The ESV that we typically use here translates it as a positive statement about Judah, who's the southern kingdom of Israel. And so it sounds like it's a contrast with Israel in the north, that Israel's full of lies and deceit toward God, but Judah at least is still faithful to him. But what's confusing about that is if you look ahead a little bit at where we're going here in chapter 12, verse 2, God's about to bring an accusation against Judah. So it's like one minute Judah's good, and the next minute Judah's bad. And so like what's going on here? And so if you happen to have a different translation, like the NIV or the CSB, you'll notice that they translate that verse from a negative perspective. The NIV says, Judah is unruly against God, even against the faithful Holy One. And the CSB translates it, Judah still wanders with God and is faithful to the holy ones, like small h and small o. And so why are these different translations so different on this verse? Well, the thing is, the original language here is vague. It's really unclear whether the word God here is referring to the Lord or whether it's just some generic God. It could really be either one. And then I think the CSB gets it right there with the lowercase holy ones, plural. So it's not necessarily referring to the Lord there either. And then the word walks in the ESV is probably closer to wanders like the CSB has. It has this picture of like wavering back and forth. And so it seems like what's going on here is that Hosea is being intentionally vague. Like he's wording it in a way that's supposed to sound, on one hand, like Judah looks like they're walking with God, but they're actually wandering from the Lord. They're wavering back and forth between God and the gods around them. So they're just as deceitful as Israel. Both Israel and Judah are surrounding God with lies and deceit. Like they're not really following him. They're ganging up against him is the picture here. And so how are they doing that? Let's keep going and we'll see. 12:1 here. Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. We'll come back to that verse in just a minute. Let's keep going for right now. Chapter 12, verse 2. The Lord has an indictment against Judah and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. So God says that he has an accusation against Judah. But then he changes names in the middle of that verse, in verse 2 there, and starts talking about Jacob. He says he's going to punish Jacob for his ways and repay him according to his deeds. And so then look what he says next in verse 3. It says, in the womb he took his brother by the heel. In his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel. And there God spoke with us, the Lord, the God of hosts. The Lord is his memorial name. So if you're familiar at all with the story of Jacob back in Genesis, you recognize the deeds here that Hosea begins to list out after saying that the Lord is going to punish Jacob for his deeds. They come from there. But then at the end of verse 4, there's a shift. It basically says that when God met with Jacob at Bethel, he wasn't just speaking to Jacob. It says he spoke with us, meaning all of Jacob's descendants as well. So what's going on here is Hosea is connecting the people of Judah in his day to their ancestor Jacob in the past and saying, you all are just like him. And what God said to him, he's saying to you as well. And so there in verses 3 and 4, we get a really short summary of the story of Jacob, which hits on a couple of key points in his story. We get one snapshot from his birth, and then another from when he was a grown man. And the point is that those two instances pretty much sum up Jacob. And so this is where it's really important for us to remember, though, Jacob's story. And so hopefully for most of you, you're at least familiar with that, but we need to go back and just review really quickly so that we're all on the same page here and so that we pick up on the connections that Hosea is making here. So if you remember back in Genesis 25 is kind of where the story of Jacob picks up. And so Jacob's parents were Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac was the son of Abraham, the one that God promised to Abraham and Sarah, who was finally born when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90. And so Isaac grows up, he marries Rebekah, and in Genesis 25, Isaac and Rebekah get pregnant, and God comes to Rebekah and tells her that there are twins in her womb. He tells her then, before the babies were even born, that the older is going to serve the younger. And so they know from the very beginning that the younger son is the one that God has chosen to carry on the covenant blessings that have been passed down from Abraham to Isaac. And so when it comes time for the babies to be born, the firstborn is red and hairy all over, and they name him Esau. But then grabbing onto Esau's heel as he's being born is the other baby. He does not want to be left behind. And so because of this, they name him Jacob, which it sounds like the word for heel grabber. But what's interesting is that rather than just being cute, that word actually has the sense of trying to drag someone down to take their place. And it has the sense of to deceive. And it turns out that this is a pretty fitting name for Jacob. His whole life becomes characterized by trying to get ahead, by deceiving and scheming and manipulating. And Genesis wastes no time showing us this. Like immediately after the birth story in Genesis 25 is the story of Jacob manipulating his brother Esau out of his birthright, which was the special portion of the inheritance reserved for the firstborn. And now again, like God had already said, like not that very many verses before, that Jacob, like before Jacob was even born, his older brother is going to serve him. And so instead of, though, waiting for God to fulfill that promise, we see Jacob immediately beginning to take matters into his own hands. And he manipulates Esau into trading his birthright for a bowl of stew. And Jacob doesn't stop there. In Genesis 27, he disguises himself as his brother and deceives his blind father into giving him the blessing of the firstborn as well. And so you can imagine Esau isn't too happy about any of that. And so Jacob ends up running away to his mother's brother in Aram. And on the way, God comes to him in a dream. And so in Genesis 28, Jacob has a dream of a ladder or steps going up to heaven, and angels are going up and down on this ladder. And at the very top, God is standing, and God tells Jacob that he's going to give him the covenant blessing that had passed down from Abraham to Isaac. He's going to give him the land. He's going to multiply his offspring. All the families of the earth are going to be blessed through him, and God is going to be with him wherever he goes. So not only before he was born, but then now directly to him, God has told Jacob that he's going to bless him. Like he doesn't need to deceive and scheme to get ahead. So when Jacob wakes up, he names that place Bethel, or the house of God, but he doesn't yet leave behind his sinful ways. He goes on then to his uncle Laban's place, and at first there, he gets a taste of his own medicine, right? Like Laban deceives Jacob into marrying the wrong daughter, and then manipulates Jacob into working for him as a shepherd for 14 years so that he can ultimately marry Rachel, who he loved and wanted to marry in the first place. But Jacob's not about to be out-deceived, and so he manipulates Laban and Laban's sheep. And in the end, Jacob ends up owning most of Laban's flock. And so now Laban's not too happy with Jacob either. And so Jacob realizes it's time to leave while he's ahead. And he takes his family and his sheep and he runs away to go back home now. And so on the way, Laban catches up to Jacob, pretty upset that Jacob would just run away like that without letting him say goodbye to his daughters and his grandchildren. But he's also accusing Jacob of stealing some household idols that belong to Laban. And so Laban searches all over the place, but he's not able to find these idols, and he ends up letting Jacob go. But before they part ways, they set up a pillar and a pile of stones, and basically they say to each other that neither one of them is going to go past this point to bother the other one anymore, right? And the name of that place becomes Gilead. And so then now Laban's behind him, Jacob's looking ahead, but now he realizes that there's a bigger problem ahead of him, right? Like he's headed back toward his brother Esau, and they didn't exactly leave on the best terms before. So he starts to get pretty worried now. And at this point, Jacob finally cries out to God for help. He's so nervous that he actually goes that far. But then he does what he always does again. He starts to scheme and manipulate. He puts together a bribe to send ahead to try to manipulate Esau, and then he comes up with this plan to protect at least part of his family, like the part of his family that he cares about the most, and he puts all this plan into motion. And then that night, while he's all alone, God comes and wrestles with Jacob. And they wrestled all night long. Like Jacob would not give up. Like this is how desperate and afraid he is. Like he will not let go. And do you remember what happened? At the end, God, the next morning, they wrestle all night long. The next morning, God touches Jacob's hip and puts it out of socket and tells Jacob to let him go. Jacob's like, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. Like he just will not let go. And like God has to be thinking at this point, like seriously? Like haven't you paid attention? Like I've already blessed you. I told you back before you were born, and then I told you again at Bethel, like, I've already blessed you. Like, why are you fighting so hard? And so as we read Jacob's story in Genesis, we can see all along, though, that while Jacob is deceiving and scheming and manipulating, that it is actually God who's the one who's protecting him, who's providing for him and carrying him along, just like he said he would. So if Jacob would even have just been paying attention, he would have seen that God is keeping his promise. But Jacob didn't seem to realize it, and he just could not trust God to keep his promise. Like, he lived his whole life as if it was all up to him. Like, he scraped, he clawed, he manipulated, he deceived, he wrestled his whole life for what God had already told him was his and what God alone could give him. Like, that's what characterized Jacob. And so bringing that story then back into Hosea 12, what Hosea is saying is that Judah and really all of Israel are a bunch of deceivers just like their father Jacob. And that's the first point on your handout here. You can see this on your handout. Like, Israel is deceitful like Jacob, their father. And in light of what we just saw about Jacob and what characterized Jacob, here's specifically what he means by that. It says, instead of trusting the Lord to bless them, they tried to take matters into their own hands. Like, instead of trusting the Lord to bless him, Jacob was constantly trying to take matters into his own hands. And instead of trusting the Lord to bless them, Israel is doing the exact same thing. Like, God had given them all these promises of blessing. He was going to establish their kingdom. He was going to make them great. He was going to defeat all their enemies. He was going to give them everything they needed. And ultimately, all the other nations of the earth would be blessed through them. Like, all they had to do was be faithful to God and trust him to fulfill his promises. But what did they do? Like, they were unfaithful to him, right? They left him for other gods. They didn't trust him to keep his promises. They were afraid that maybe he wouldn't protect them, he wouldn't provide for them, and so they took matters into their own hands. And so how did they do that? Hosea gives us 3 examples here in this chapter of how they were deceitful like Jacob, their father. You can see these on your handout. First of all, Israel pursued political alliances to protect themselves instead of trusting in the Lord to protect them. We see this back in chapter 12, verse 1. So look back up there with me real quick. We read this earlier, but let's back up and look at this. 12:1 says, Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. Like, we've seen this throughout the book of Hosea. Like, one of the main ways that that Israel continues to act unfaithfully toward God is by pursuing these political alliances with the nations around them. Over and over again, instead of trusting God to protect them, they feel like they have to manipulate things for their own benefit by making covenants with nations like Assyria to protect them from their enemies, by sending resources to nations like Egypt to stay on their good side. And God is saying in this verse here that these alliances are pointless. It's like they're chasing after the wind. Like, feeds on here, it has the idea of herding. Like they're trying to herd the wind. They're trying to get it to go where they want it to go. They're trying to get it to stay where they want it to stay. But the point is, the wind is uncontrollable. Like, you can't do that. And then it says they pursue the east wind all day long. Like, the east wind was this hot, dry wind that would blow through the area and just dry out and destroy whatever it touched. So not only are they trying to control what's uncontrollable, they're chasing after something that's actually dangerous and destructive. And so these political alliances don't make any sense. Like, not only can Israel not control them, they may just turn around and destroy them. But man, they're committed. It says they pursue this all day long. Like, you can just hear the same sort of desperation in their political alliances that you hear in Jacob as he deceives and manipulates and wrestles. Like, they're so convinced that they have to take things into their own hands. They keep fighting and just don't realize that they're pursuing the wind. So that's the first way that Israel's deception manifests itself, was in their pursuit of these political alliances. The second way, you can see this on your handout, the second way is that they cheated and oppressed others for their own financial gain instead of trusting in the Lord to provide for them. They cheated and oppressed others for their own financial gain instead of trusting in the Lord to provide for them. We see this starting in verse 7. It says, a merchant in whose hands are false balances, he loves to oppress. Ephraim has said, but I'm rich. I've found wealth for myself. In all my labors, they cannot find in me iniquity or sin. So another way here that Israel proved themselves to be deceivers, just like Jacob, their father, was by cheating and oppressing others for their own financial gain. Like, instead of trusting the Lord to provide for them like he promised that he would, they resorted to the same unjust strategies as the nations around them. Like these false balances here would have been used in the market when you're selling something. Like you'd have one of those scales, where you put some weights on one side, and then you put something like food or goods on the other side until it balances out, and then you know how much to charge someone for whatever you're selling them. But what some of these unjust merchants would do is have weights that were marked as one weight, but actually weighed less than what they were supposed to, so that they could cheat their customers and charge them more. So maybe I would charge you for like 5 pounds of flour, but actually only give you 4, and you have no way of knowing any difference. And God hates this practice. Like it's all through the Bible. Proverbs 20, verse 10 says, "Unequal weights and unequal measures are both and alike an abomination to the Lord." Proverbs 20:23 says, "Unequal weights are an abomination to the Lord. False scales are not good." God told Israel back in Leviticus 19, 35 and 36 that they were not to do this. He said they were to have just weights and just balances. But instead of trusting in the Lord to provide for them, they take matters into their own hands, and they cheat others for their own benefit. And this verse here, it says not only did they do this, they did it boldly. Like the rest of verse 7 says, they love to oppress. Like they gladly take advantage of those who are weaker than them, which is how oppression works, right? The strong take advantage of the weak, which makes the weak weaker and the strong stronger. And verse 8 says that Ephraim definitely sees themselves in that strong category. Like they're rich. And they're convinced that because of their wealth, like they're untouchable. It's not that they think they really haven't done anything wrong. They just believe that they're above the law because of their position of power and because of their wealth. But just like Jacob, like they don't realize that the riches that they have aren't because of their own deceit and scheming. Like they think they got it all by themselves because they were so clever. But they don't realize it's actually because God has been blessing them all along. Like that's what the first part of verse 9 is saying here. He says, "I'm the Lord your God from the land of Egypt." It's like God's saying, hello, like remember me, the one who brought you out of Egypt and gave you this land and all the blessings you have? Like you didn't do this yourself. But instead of seeing how the Lord had provided for them, instead of trusting the Lord to provide for them like he promised, they took matters into their own hands and cheated and oppressed others for their own financial gain. The third way that Israel's deception manifests itself was that they sacrificed to idols without realizing that the Lord was the one shepherding them. They sacrificed to idols without realizing that the Lord was the one shepherding them. You see this in verse 10. It says, "I spoke to the prophets. It was I who multiplied visions, and through the prophets gave parables. If there's iniquity in Gilead, they shall surely come to nothing. In Gilgal, they sacrifice bulls. Their altars also are like stone heaps on the furrows of the field. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. There Israel served for a wife, and for a wife he guarded sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was guarded." So this section is a little hard to follow. It's bookended by God explaining how he worked and spoke through prophets to lead Israel. And so in verse 10, he says that he spoke to the prophets, he gave them visions, he gave parables through them. So when Israel was hearing from a prophet, they were hearing from God himself. And then the reason God spoke to his people through prophets is explained in verses 12 and 13 at the end. So Hosea brings Jacob back up as an example. And so just like Jacob guarded sheep in Aram, remember we heard about that when we were talking through his story, so that he could marry Rachel, God is doing the same thing through the prophets. And so remember, this whole book of Hosea is about how God is pursuing his wife, Israel. And so just like Jacob pursued his wife by shepherding, God is pursuing his wife by shepherding as well. But in this illustration, not only is Israel the wife being pursued, they're also the sheep as well. And God is shepherding them through the prophets. First, through Moses, the prophet, who God used to bring Israel up out of Egypt. And then he continued to guard and protect and shepherd them through many other prophets, including Hosea, who God spoke to and gave visions to and gave parables to. So all along the way, God was pursuing Israel like Jacob was pursuing his wife. And God was shepherding and guarding them through the prophets. But how did Israel respond? They respond by thankfulness to God and faithfulness to God and worshiping God. Like, no, that's not what it's been at all the way through this book. They turned instead to idols, and they sacrificed to idols. And that's what verse 11 says here. The first part there goes back to Jacob's story again. Remember what happened at Gilead? Like that's where where Laban caught up with Jacob as he was running from him. And what happened when Laban caught up to Jacob? He accused him of stealing his household idols, right? And he searched through all Jacob's stuff to try to find these idols. But Rachel had hidden them, and so they got away with it. But God's saying, you're not going to be able to deceive me like you did Laban, like Jacob did Laban. Like I'm going to search, and you're not going to be able to hide the idols this time. And he finds them in Gilgal, in the next part of the verse here. Gilgal was one of their main idol worship centers. But it didn't start out that way. The history of Gilgal is incredible too. Like Gilgal was where Israel first crossed the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And if you remember that story, what they did when they first got over there was while the priests are still standing in the middle of the Jordan River and the waters dried up, Joshua has 12 people go back into the middle of the river, grab 12 stones and bring them out, and they set these up as a pillar in Gilgal to remind them of what God had done for them and bringing them through the wilderness, bringing them across the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. And so God had been faithful to them, and he brought them into the land, and they set up this reminder for themselves. But instead then of this being the place that continued to remind them of God's faithfulness to them and his power in bringing them into the land, they turned it instead into a center of idolatry. And so instead of just this one heap of stones that's to remind them of what God had done for them, they had piles of stones and altars everywhere to all these false gods. And God says these altars are like stone heaps in the furrows of the field. And like I'm not a farmer, but I don't think piles of stones are helpful when you're trying to plow your field and plant your seeds. Like they would get in the way, they would trip you up, they would break your farming equipment, they would keep your land from being as productive as it could be. And like the irony in all this is that they're sacrificing to these false gods because they think that Baal will increase their harvest. And God's saying it's doing the exact opposite. It's having the exact opposite effect. And so the reason that verse is bookended by the parts about God shepherding his people through the prophets is that we're supposed to see the contradiction here. That Israel is sacrificing to these idols to try to manipulate a good harvest for themselves. And they're completely ignoring the fact that God is sending these prophets to shepherd and guard them. And they're not listening to the prophets at all. And so in all of this, the accusation against Israel is that they're deceitful like their father Jacob. All their political alliances, their social injustice, their spiritual adultery are all proof of their deceitfulness. And God is going to deal seriously with their deceitfulness. You see that next on your handout. That this is exactly what God warned them in chapter 12, verse 2. It says he has an indictment against Judah. He's going to punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. And then at the end of this chapter in 12:14, it says he will repay him for his disgraceful deeds. Like, it's the same principle we saw a couple of weeks ago in Hosea 10. God is warning Israel that they're going to reap what they sow. And so in this passage, he gives a couple of specific ways that God warns Israel that he's going to deal with their deceitfulness. You can see the first one in verse 9. It says he will send them back into the wilderness. Like this is what he says after the accusation about Israel's injustice and oppression. They say, oh, I'm rich. You can't touch me. And God says in verse 9, I'm the Lord your God from the land of Egypt. I will again make you dwell in tents as in the days of the appointed feasts. Like he says, you think you're untouchable because you're rich, but I'm God. I'm the one who brought you into the land from Egypt and gave you everything that you have, and I can take it all away. And that's what the punishment's going to be. He's going to send them back into the wilderness as if they'd never entered the land. Like the appointed feast here, it's the Feast of Tabernacles. Every year, Israel would spend a week living in a tent like they would have used to live in when they were wandering in the wilderness to remind them of how God had preserved them during that time. But it was also this yearly reminder of how not fun those 40 years were, right? Like as a reminder, like you really don't want to go back to living like that again. It was a reminder of where they came from and how God had been faithful to them and how he blessed them by bringing them into the land so that they didn't have to live like that anymore. But because of their deceitfulness, God says that one of the ways he's going to deal with them is by exiling them from the land and sending them back into the wilderness again. And we've seen this a few other times in Hosea. The result of Israel's unfaithfulness is going to be the Exodus reversed, or in this case, Joshua reversed. But that's not all. Even more serious than this is the punishment promised in 12:14. It says, he will leave their blood guilt on them. Look at verse 14 here. Ephraim has given bitter provocation, so his Lord will leave his blood guilt on him, and he will repay him for his disgraceful deeds. Like, all this comes on the heels of the final accusation of Israel's continued idolatry. Like, God continues to shepherd and guard them, but they just keep provoking him with their sacrifices to idols. And so notice the relationship language changes here. It's no longer God pursuing his wife or shepherding his sheep. Lord here, it's lowercase, so it's not God's name. Like, this is a title. It's the title for a master. Like, God is now relating to Israel as their master. And it's like he's done pursuing them. He's done covering over their sin. He's going to hold them accountable. Like, they are guilty of crimes that deserve capital punishment, and he's going to leave their blood guilt on them. And that's how the chapter ends. Like, I mean, it's terrifying. But I mentioned there's one glimmer of hope in this passage. It's in the one verse that we skipped over earlier. So if you remember, we left off Jacob's story when he's wrestling with God and begging God to bless him. And so, yeah, you remember the rest of that story? What did God do to Jacob? Kind of touched on it a little bit. Like, he broke him, right? He humbled him. And he made him stop scheming and deceiving. Like, God touched Jacob's hip. He puts it out of socket, and he says, let me go. And Jacob's not going to do it. He still won't let go. He says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And so what does God say next? He says, what's your name? So remember when Jacob was deceiving his father into giving him the blessing? He disguised himself as